Well, hello everyone and welcome to Quintopia. Today's video will be a little bit different. Today I will be taking you through the steps I took to convert the Tomix 4018 high-rise office building into a lit-up building and some modifications and painting I did to it. So without further ado, let's get started. The first step is to disassemble the building. Shown here in the photo is the original 3 buildings put together without painting or lighting, which are then disassembled to move on to step 2. Step 2 involves the process of painting all of the plastic parts, except for obviously the clear windows. The main thing in this part is really make sure you also give a good coat of paint to the interior of the buildings to stop the light from passing through the plastic once you've added your lights to the interior. You don't want light shining through the walls. Now I use just regular spray paint, and while I'm waiting for that to dry, I move on and I start working on other things to prepare for the building. Step 3 is really the lighting preparation, and in this case I used LEDs mounted on a strip. These are SMD LEDs, so they're really small. They're mounted on a strip of paper, self-adhesive, flexible circuit board sort of material, and as the note says, you can find these on eBay from various suppliers. They come in a long strip. You then cut them up into sections of either 3 or 6 LEDs per section, and then solder wires onto the positive and negative contact points located on the strips. As you can see here at this stage, I'm getting all the wiring ready for each strip and soldering them on and getting it all prepared to add to the interior of the building. These LED strips are really convenient because the resistance is already built into the strip, and as long as you're cutting them at the appropriate marks where the contact strips are, all you really need to do is solder the wires onto those contact strips and then add your 12-volt DC power supply. At this point, I've already applied the wire to the positive terminal, and that's indicated by the red color. And on the other side of the strip, I'm applying a white color wire for the negative connection to the power supply. Once I show you how I decided to assemble this building, I took a different approach than I usually did. It'll make sense why I'm putting a positive wire on one end and a negative wire on the other end. Essentially, my approach is to use something along the lines of the old knob and tube wiring, where you have 2 separate main power supplies. I guess you could call them sort of bus wiring system, but this time they're going to be going vertically up through the floors of the building, and this will make wiring a lot easier because you won't have to deal with the challenge of having a lot of different wire strands running through multiple floors of the building, which is always a problem. Now this next step is more of an optional step, and what I had to determine I wanted to do is that, given the way the windows are designed, that there's nothing blocking the space between floors. You can see on the plastic piece I just showed, it's transparent all the way through. So I decided, in order to give the illusion that each of these sections was actually 2 floors and not 1, I masked out the window area, and I'm going to spray paint the intermediary floor areas. And as you can tell, I'm putting down traditional, just plain old masking tape there, and then I'll leave the spot blank between the floors for painting later on. Now, as I'm using spray paint, one of the important things I always do is take a piece of a masking tape, lay it down on its back side so the adhesive side is facing up, then put the piece that you're going to paint on it, so when you're spraying it with a spray paint can, your parts don't blow all over the place. And this is something I've discovered through trial and error. And then, of course, when you're done with your spray painting, of course, let it dry. And don't put on too thick of a coat. If you make the coat too thick, at least each coat needs to be thin enough so it doesn't bleed under the tape. I actually applied about 2 coats to these pieces to ensure that they were light enough so that they didn't go through, but also that there was enough paint there to stop any light from coming through the new floor area between the floors. Another optional step is the roof sign. I decided to go with some signage, big corporate logo on the top of this building to give some more light. You can see the piece here I'm holding up are the original ends of the Tomix 40018 office building. I cut those off with a razor saw, and in between those edges, instead of having solid plastic, I'll be using some logos I printed off on my laser printer, which are printed on transparency paper along with some regular bond paper By putting these together, you'll get the opacity, but also enough transparency for light to come through it to create the effect of a sign. And you can see here the piece I've got has the red coloration, and but enough opacity and transparency to allow light through, but to make it look like the letters are the only thing lit up. These will then be mounted to the ends of the original building top utility section, which here I'm preparing to paint with a dark color to match the rest of the building. Now, one of the things you need to ensure you take care of when you light the interior of buildings is the interior floors, walls, and the other details that are going to be very apparent once you light a building. So that's step 4, creating different pieces of foam core based walls, flooring, and so forth to give the interior some sense of it's a real place and not just an empty shell lit up with lights. In this sequence, I'm actually slicing up some pieces of foam core to create not only walls but interior supports to hold the floors, as the Tomix building doesn't have single floors. Then I also cut out and prepared some background wall interiors. These are background wall interiors I created on my computer, and they're detailed enough and useful enough to glue into the back of a wall or put on a wall so that they do look like a real place rather than, again, just empty blank plastic walls. These are the floor sections, and again, because the Tomix building doesn't have intermediary floors between each of its sections, you need to create intermediary sections to give that illusion that each floor is actually one floor and not a big empty space that's 2 stories high. Here I'm using my glue gun, and I'll be attaching these foam core pieces so that they're correctly spaced between each floor, and I had to measure very carefully to ensure that these foam core edges would line up right on the window sections that I earlier painted. Now, moving on to step 5, we're finally getting to a part that we're going to start a little bit more fun, and this is test fitting and wiring preparation. At this point, after I've already painted out the intermediary floor pieces on the plastic clear window sections, I'm placing them inside my completely painted interior and exterior building shell pieces to ensure that they fit correctly. And I'm going to be doing all of this to test fit my flooring to make sure that the additional space that the plastic windows create still allows enough space for my pieces and everything fits good enough. So there we go. You can see that I got the piece in this section. Now what I'm going to do is add in my intermediary floor. Oops, I'm not going to do that yet. I'm going to add in my background piece. Again, using a little dab of hot glue from the glue gun just on the back of the building. I'm going to take this little section of interior background and put it on the back wall. The nice thing about the hot glue is it actually adheres really quickly, and it can be a little messy, so watch your little spider threads. Here's the foam core intermediary floor, and you can see the foam core sections I cut out to give it the right spacing, and that's generally the alignment it's going to take. You also note a couple of holes on each end, and these are the holes where the copper wire will go through to allow electricity to get up to each of the body sections, shell sections, to allow wiring of the SMD strips. And you can see there, right there, there's the negative lead, and it's soldered on, make sure it's on tight. Now I'm going to remove the adhesive backing and place that onto the foam core to give light to this floor. I don't have quite sharp enough fingernails to do it quickly. Make sure I put it on the right side because it's going to go on the ceiling, obviously. And this one will actually go on the interior of this building, so the top floor of the two-story section. Press it down nice and tight. It's in there. And I try to get them as near to the window as possible, because if you put them too far back, too much shadow will be blasted on the window and it'll look darker. So the closer you put your lights to the window, the better it'll be for visibility's sake. Now I'm preparing to put that foam core piece in. And here you can see putting the leads from the SMD LED strip through those holes that were already pre-drilled. And probably need to make those holes a little bit bigger. And in this manner, I'll have positive and negative on opposite sides of the building and able to run that copper lead up through the entire building length without having to worry about a lot of stripping of the wire insulation. So the floor fits, the wire leads are through, and it looks like we're ready to move on to assembling the rest of the building. So it looks like everything's working out okay. And now time for step 7, assembly. This is the fun part. Here's the copper wire that will carry power up until the different floors. And my approach here was very different. I haven't used this approach before in any other building, but the idea was that rather than have multiple strands of wire leads going to the power on each level, I decided to have one, almost a bus system of wiring. So you're going to have, there I am inserting the positive length of this very rigid but flexible copper wire into the positive section, and I'll put another section in for the negative side of the building as well. In this shot, you can actually see I've got the two copper leads going into one of the floor sections, and one side is for the negative, one side is for the positive. What I'll do next is attach the unsoldered wire to the copper bus wire, I guess, for lack of a better word. And the trick is to get it on there nice and tight. I'm going to wrap it around several times. Now I've got the wires on there, I'm ready to solder them on. Now I'm using my 30-watt soldering iron because I can use the higher temperature to quickly bond it to that thicker copper wire. And the red's attached. And now we'll put the negative white wire, attach that to solder on. Make sure it's good and soft and making correct contact. Also make sure with your soldering iron you don't touch the plastic because it will melt very quickly any plastic pieces. I'll check out my wiring, see if it works. There it goes. We're in good shape. Alright, well now through the magic of technology I'll take you through the rest of the assembly, which basically follows the same steps at a higher rate of speed, so you don't have to sit through the several hours of time it took to actually do this in person. So what you're seeing me do here is fitting one of the two-story sections with its foam core section installed to create two floors, and then the two-story section. Fitting it, making sure it's tight, getting the copper wire to run through the pre-drilled holes. Sometimes the holes had to be re-drilled because they weren't quite aligned correctly. Wrapping the leads around the copper wire, and then soldering those leads onto the copper wire itself. And occasionally what I'm doing is putting the power to it to make sure that the lights are working, so that you don't solder something on then find out later that you had it soldered on backwards or something. And really all I'm doing here is just the rather tedious, but actually this is the fun part, because you're starting to see the building finally take shape after a lot of steps and preparation. It's finally starting to come together and look like a building and not just a bunch of plastic parts. You'll also notice that I'm putting in walls, particularly on the bottom floor of the two-story sections. Now the bottom floor of the two-story sections is actually considerably shorter than the top floor. When I measured my original foam core pieces, I didn't account for that, so I had to modify them in progress to make sure that they fit correctly so that all the floors would come together nicely. In some cases I had to make some adjustments on the fly, as I said. And again, what I'm doing there is trying to put a back wall in there with some of that pre-painted stuff so that it looks like there's a real floor there and not just an empty cavity. Now, having gotten the rest of the main part of the building completed, it's time to move on to the roof and the ground floor and get those ready. As you can tell here in this shot, I'm removing the masking tape after painting the building. The exterior part of it got the black granite look I was going for the exterior, and then the very top of it got a light gray. You can tell I've drilled some holes into the roof to allow for the red lights that will act as sort of the typical red lights you see on tall structures to warn aircraft or whatever. These LED lights are not the SMD strip lights that I used for the interiors of the building. These actually are something else I got off eBay, and they're just 12-volt DC ready red LED bulbs, 3mm bulbs. So again, another nice feature of these is you don't have to worry about adding your own resistors, and you can avoid the step of soldering on resistors, so just a time-saving feature. Obviously, they're going to cost you a little bit more than doing it yourself, but for something like that's a really unusual or uncommon for me, I don't keep red LEDs on hand, so these actually work out quite conveniently. The only downside is they don't flash. Now what I'm doing here is making sure that all my wiring for this roof section will sit flat so that when it's placed on the rest of the building, um, the, the roof will actually sit flush with the rest of the structure. And what I'll do is I'll strip off the the leads to those wires there, solder them together, and make those ready to attach to the copper tubing going through the rest of the building so that they get power. The other light, or the other electrical requirement for the top of the building is for the new roof sign with the SkyNet logo. Here I'm using Walther's Goo Glue to attach it to the original ends to the utility building that goes on the top of the Tomix building. I cut those off with a razor saw. I'm now putting glue on it to attach my new sections, which have the ability to have the backlit SkyNet logo. So getting the glue on there, and you'll notice throughout this video that I've used several different glues, really depending on the application. Some glues are better for a tight bond, but they definitely don't want that glue to be visible. And other glues do a nicer job with bonding plastic to plastic, and it may be a bit visible. So here I am putting on the new SkyNet section, which is a piece of transparent acrylic, a color logo of the SkyNet logo on regular bond white paper, and then the black transparency with the clear section for the SkyNet letters. Gluing it together and making sure it's nice and square, and it will then go on the top of the building, where it will be backlit by another strip of the SMD LEDs on the strip. It's actually 6 LEDs which will be bent around a piece of plastic to provide nice bright lighting to project the lit logo or the lit letter effect that I'm looking for with this rooftop sign. So at this point in the building, we've got just about everything done except for the ground floor. And what I'm doing here is checking out the electrical connections, making sure all of the LEDs are lighting up as they should on the floors where they are installed, checking for the placement of my new roof sign light, and just making sure generally that the building has the look I was going for and everything's working. Now time to move on to doing something about this ground floor where, as you can tell, I'm using just a plastic cube for the moment. A newer technique that I've started using that I find is really effective is to print designs for windows, get the window frames using a laser printer and clear transparency sheets used for overhead projectors. I'm not sure if overhead projectors are actually used anywhere anymore, but you certainly can find these clear transparency sheets at office supply stores. I use a laser printer for the obvious reason that the laser toner just seems to be a little bit more sturdier and a little bit more durable for this sort of application than an inkjet printer is. And what I'll do here is I'll cut out the actual window frames out of the transparent sheet, and then I'm going to glue them to the acrylic sheets that make up the ground floor section. Obviously, creating this design in the window frames requires a little bit of work on the computer using some sort of illustration program, and measure out the dimensions and the general design you're looking for, and then printing it on some sort of laser printer. The measurements I used here, the width of those frames you see are based on the same width of the tiles on the Tomix structure. So trying to make sure that there's some consistency in the design between the glass window frames on the ground floor and the rest of the building. Well, as you can tell, I'm getting ready to glue this transparency sheet material onto the section of acrylic, which you can almost make out there on my cutting mat, to create the basis of the ground floor. I'm using the window glue stuff made by Testers, forget the exact name. You saw me flash the container. I'm still looking for the perfect adhesive to use on windows. Everything sort of always leaves a very fuzzy or cloudy sort of residue on the glass, so there's no perfect solution yet that I found anyway. Now after these have had time to dry and settle on here, I'm going to actually cover over sections of this with some black plastic Sintra, which is expanded foam PVC material I use a lot, and I will be scribing by hand the same sort of line dimensions as the rest of the Tomix building, gluing those on top of these in the same color so that the ground floor is not completely glass enclosed, but appears to have the look of the exterior material that the rest of the building has. That red film is actually some transparent red film I picked up at the hobby shop, and that's going to go behind the SkyNet logo that is also on the ground floor, so I can have a little bit of more color contrast on the bottom floor, which I think will help with the black and the blackness of the building. A little bit of red will really kind of give it a nice stark look. So as I mentioned just previously, I used this material called Sintra, which is an expanded PVC foam material that I use quite frequently. And the nice thing about it is it's lightweight, easy to cut with just a knife. And you can see here in the photo these black sections. I attempted to imitate the black tiles of the Tomix body. The original Tomix high-rise does have obviously a ground floor, but it's a very just a single story, very flat, very retail oriented. And for the structure, I wanted something a little bit more corporate, ostentatious, and so forth. The acrylic material on the left is actually what I used for the actual base, and that's obviously what the transparent sheets with the laser printed window frames get glued to. The untreated or untouched Sintra is actually in the background there, and those gray pieces are what that is. Well, one final step is how to add electrical connections to your building. And what I'm showing here are a product that you find on eBay called JST 2-pin connectors. And it makes it for a very simple plug and play to add things like buildings or accessories, especially on my layout where I have a lot of those. And it's very straightforward. You're going to put some heat shrink tubing on one side of the wire, wrap the connector to another lead, solder them together, put the heat shrink over it, and voila, you have a nice long cord with a very easy system of connecting your JST connectors to your 12-volt DC power supply for your accessories. This has become a new standard I've started using in the past year, I guess. And I can tell you it makes it so much nicer rather than having to go into the layout and screw things in and use wire connectors and all of that. And finally, it is complete. All that's really needs to be done now is take a few photos and then install it on the layout, which I will do momentarily. In general, I'm pretty pleased with how it turned out. There's a couple things I might do differently next time, but every building is an experiment. Every building has its own way of best addressing some of the challenges of lighting or detailing. As you can see here on the layout, it kind of does fit in nicely. It definitely has a different look than everything else, and I'm pleased with it. And so as the camera pans by the SkyNet skyscraper one more time, we'll take a look at how it used to look before it was painted, but still in its 3 Tomix buildings put together. I think it's a bit of an improvement. Hope you agree, and I hope you enjoyed this video. There's no real right or wrong way to do this sort of stuff, but hopefully a couple of my tips were useful for you. If you have any questions, please visit my blog, quintopia.com. Thank you very much. Bye.